The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the dusty street of redemption, a town whose name was a bitter joke. For Ilara, there was no redemption, only the final, humiliating chapter of her fall. She stood on a crude wooden platform next to a man with a sweat-stained hat and a voice like gravel grinding in a dry creek bed. He was auctioning off the last of her husband's debts, and she was the final lot. Her calico dress was worn thin, her hands were bound loosely in front of her, and her gaze was fixed on a loose board at her feet, refusing to meet the eyes of the men gathered below. They were a mix of ranchers, drifters, and townsfolk, their faces a blur of curiosity and contempt. "What am I bid for the indenture of this woman, Ilara Stone?" The auctioneer, but a portly man named Croft, who held the town's bank and half its souls in his ledger, bellowed, "A good worker, strong back, despite her unfortunate circumstances. The debt stands at $100. Her term is for 2 years of service to whoever clears it. Do I hear 50?" Silence. The only sounds were the buzz of flies and the nervous shuffle of boots in the dust. $50 was a fortune. It was more than a good horse. A woman, even a young one, who came with the baggage of a dead, indebted husband and the shame of a public auction, was not worth $50. She was worth nothing. She knew it. They knew it. Croft knew it. But the performance was part of the punishment. 30 then. A bargain for 2 years' labor, cooking, cleaning, laundry. He listed her future like the features of a plow horse. A cruel laugh cut through the crowd. "I'll give you $1, Croft, for the trouble of cartin' her away." More laughter followed. Ilara flinched, a small, involuntary movement. Her knuckles, already white, grew impossibly tighter. She had been through starvation on the trail, the fever that took her Thomas, the slow, grinding poverty that followed. But this public stripping of her humanity, was a new and colder hell. She was no longer a person. She was a debt, an object. Croft's face soured. The humiliation was meant for her, not him. "This is a legal proceeding, not a saloon joke. We need a serious bid to clear the books." His gaze swept the crowd, looking for a man with a mean streak or a lonely ranch big enough to lose a woman in. Then, a new voice spoke, quiet but carrying a weight that silenced the murmurs instantly. $2. Every head turned. Ilara's head snapped up against her will. He stood at the back of the small crowd, leaning against a porch post of the general store. He was tall, dressed in dark, practical clothing that bore the dust of a long ride but none of the town's grime. His face was all harsh angles and shadow under the brim of a black hat, a landscape carved by sun and something harder. She had seen him once before, riding through town on a powerful black horse, a man who moved as if the ground itself owed him deference, Silas Blackwood. His ranch, the Blackwood Creek, was the largest in the territory, a kingdom of grass and cattle that stretched to the horizon. Croft blinked, thrown off balance. "Mr. Blackwood, I was expecting a more substantial—" "You had a bid for $1, Silas Blackwood said, his voice flat, Isha motionless. "I bid 2. Is there another?" He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. His eyes, cold and gray as a winter river, swept over the other men. No one spoke. The man who had bid $1 suddenly found the dust on his boots fascinating. $2? Croft sputtered, his face flushing with anger and embarrassment. It was an insult, a dismissal. Blackwood wasn't bidding on the woman. He was ending the spectacle. "Going once," Blackwood said, his voice still quiet, but now laced with an unmistakable thread of command. He wasn't asking, he was closing the deal. Croft looked around wildly. He was trapped. To refuse the bid was to defy the most powerful man in the county. To accept it was to be made a fool of. He swallowed his pride, the motion visible in his thick neck. "Sold," he bit out, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "For $2, to Mr. Blackwood. Someone cut the rope on her wrists. The auction was over. Silas Blackwood pushed himself off the post and walked not to the platform, but to Croft. He dropped $2 silver into the banker's palm, the clink of the coins loud in the sudden stillness. He did not look at Ilara. He did not acknowledge her existence. "The debt is paid," Blackwood stated. "Her papers." Croft, fuming, scribbled a receipt, his hand shaking with fury. He thrust the paper at Blackwood. Silas took it, folded it once, and tucked it into his coat pocket. Only then did he turn his head slightly, his gaze finally falling on Ilara. It was not a kind look. It was not a cruel look. It was the look a man gives a stray dog he has just decided not to shoot. "Come on," he said, his voice rough. He turned and walked toward his horse without looking back to see if she was following. For a moment, Ilara could not move. Her legs were stone. The crowd began to disperse, whispering, their eyes following her with a new kind of curiosity. She was no longer just a pauper. She was Blackwood's pauper. She took a breath, the air thick with dust and humiliation, and forced her feet to move. One step, then another. She walked off the platform, down the 3 steps to the street, and followed the tall, silent man who had just bought her for the price of a cheap meal. She did not know if she had been rescued or merely transferred from one cage to another. The ride to the Blackwood Creek Ranch was silent. He rode the powerful black stallion, and she was given a placid, sway-backed mare from the livery. He had paid for it with a nod, the stable owner scurrying to saddle the horse as if the King of England had commanded it. Silas Blackwood did not speak to her. He set a steady pace, his back a rigid wall of black cloth. Ilara followed a few paces behind, the dust from his horse coating her dress, her face, her spirit. She watched him, trying to read the set of his shoulders, the line of his jaw when he glanced back to ensure she was still there. There was no softness in him. He was a man made of iron and rock, shaped by a forge she could not imagine. Why had he done it? Pity? She could not believe it. A man like that did not seem to have pity in him. Was it a whim? A casual display of power? Or did he truly need a servant so badly he would scoop one from the dregs of redemption? The sun began to dip toward the jagged peaks in the west, painting the sky in hues of orange and bruised purple. The air grew cooler. They rode through rolling grasslands that seemed to have no end, dotted with cattle that bore his brand. This was his kingdom. It was vast, beautiful, and empty. The sheer scale of it was intimidating. Her whole life had been lived in small spaces, a cramped apartment in the east, a canvas wagon, a tiny, dusty room in town. This endless land felt like another kind of prison, one with no visible walls. Finally, as twilight settled, she saw it. Tucked into a valley carved by a winding creek, lights glowed from a collection of buildings. A large 2-story ranch house built of dark timber and river stone stood as the anchor, surrounded by barns, corrals, and smaller cabins for the hands. It was not just a ranch. It was a fortress, a self-contained world. As they rode into the main yard, men stopped what they were doing to watch them. Their faces were hard, weathered by the sun and wind. They looked at their boss, then at her. Their expressions a mixture of confusion and suspicion. A woman arriving with the boss was an event. A woman arriving on a livery horse covered in dust and shame was a mystery. Blackwood dismounted in a single fluid motion. He looped his reins over a hitching post and finally turned to her. He stood there for a moment just looking, and for the first time, she felt the full force of his attention. His eyes were even colder up close, but there was something else in their depths, a weariness, a profound, bone-deep exhaustion that had nothing to do with a long day's ride. "Get down," he said. His voice was not unkind, just tired. Ilara's legs were stiff. She slid clumsily from the saddle, her feet hitting the ground with a jolt. She stood before him, her head bowed, waiting for instructions. She was his property now, for 2 years. Her life was a list of chores to be assigned. "Maria!" Blackwood called toward the house. A stout gray-haired woman with a stern but not unkind face appeared on the porch, wiping her hands on an apron. She was his housekeeper, Alara guessed. Her eyes took in the scene: her boss, the strange woman, the livery horse, and her lips tightened into a thin line. "This is Alara," Blackwood said, the name sounding foreign in his mouth. "She'll be working here. Find her a room. Give her something to eat." Maria's gaze swept over Alara, cataloging the worn dress, the dust, the shame that clung to her like a second skin. There was no welcome in her eyes, only a weary acceptance of another complication in her employer's already complicated life. "A room? In the house?" "In the barn," he corrected himself, his voice hardening slightly as if he'd caught himself in a moment of softness. "There's an empty tack room at the end. It's dry. Put a cot in there." He looked at Alara again. "You'll work for Maria. Do what she says. Don't make trouble." Without another word, he turned and strode toward the main house, his spurs ringing a lonely rhythm on the porch steps. He disappeared inside, the closing door a final, definitive sound. Alara was left alone in the yard with the housekeeper. The ranch hands had gone back to their work, though she could feel their eyes on her. She was a curiosity, a piece of flotsam washed up on the shores of Blackwood Creek. "Come," Maria said, her voice clipped. She led Alara not toward the main house, but toward the largest of the barns. The air inside was warm and smelled of hay, horses, and leather. It was a comforting smell, a scent of life and honest work that was a world away from the stale despair of her room in town. The tack room was small, windowless, and filled with the ghosts of old bridles and saddles. It was little more than a closet, but Maria, true to her boss's word, had a young ranch hand bring in a simple cot and a clean folded blanket. She also brought a basin of water, a rough bar of lye soap, and a plate with a thick slice of bread and a piece of cold beef. "You'll start in the laundry tomorrow at sunrise," Maria said from the doorway. "The boss. He doesn't like idleness." She paused, her stern facade cracking for just a moment. "And he doesn't like talk. Ian, you keep to yourself. You do your work. You'll be fine. You cause a fuss. There's nowhere to run from here." She left, pulling the heavy door almost closed, leaving Alara in the near darkness. Alara sat on the edge of the cot, the plate untouched in her lap. The water in the basin was a murky mirror. She looked at her reflection, at the stranger with the smudged face and haunted eyes. $2. That was her price. She had been bought and paid for. Now she had to survive the terms of the sale. She took a ragged breath, and, for the first time since the auction began, she allowed a single tear to trace a clean path through the dust on her cheek. The next few weeks fell into a grueling rhythm. Alara rose before the sun, her world shrinking to the laundry house, a steamy outbuilding that smelled of soap and sweat. She scrubbed clothes on a washboard until her knuckles were raw, wrestling with heavy denim and canvas worn stiff with dirt and horsehair. She worked alongside 2 other women, wives of ranch hands, who spoke to her in clipped sentences, their curiosity warring with their suspicion. They knew, as the whole ranch knew, that she was the $2 woman. The knowledge was a wall between them. She ate her meals alone, on a crate outside the laundry house, or back in her tiny room in the barn. She saw Silas Blackwood only from a distance, a glimpse of him crossing the yard, his long strides eating up the ground, the sound of his voice giving an order to his foreman. He never looked her way. He never spoke to her. It was as if their transaction in town had never happened. She was just another part of the ranch's machinery, invisible and interchangeable. But the barn was her sanctuary. At night, after the exhaustion of the day, she would sit on her cot and listen to the sounds of the horses, The soft nickering, the rustle of hay, the rhythmic thump of a hoof against a stall door. These were honest sounds, clean sounds. They soothed the raw edges of her days. She had grown up around horses, her father a failed farmer, but a gifted horseman. He had taught her their language, the silent communication of posture and breath. One afternoon, a commotion erupted from the largest corral. Shouts, curses, the splintering sound of wood. Ilara, hanging sheets on a line, saw several ranch hands trying to break a magnificent, wild-eyed stallion. It was a fiery chestnut, its muscles coiled like springs, its mane and tail a storm of dark flame. It bucked and reared, throwing off a seasoned rider with a violence that was terrifying. Silas Blackwood stood on the top rail of the fence, his arms crossed, his face a mask of cold frustration. This was not just any horse. This was a prize, a wild creature he had captured himself, and it was defying him. His foreman, a tough old man named Cole, limped away from the fence, shaking his head. "He's gonna kill someone, boss, or kill himself. He's pure poison." "He's got spirit," Blackwood countered, his voice tight. "It just needs to be aimed." But even as he said it, the stallion slammed against the fence, its eyes rolling in terror and fury. Ilara watched, her heart aching for the animal. They were trying to break it with force and fear, the only tools they knew. They were treating it like an enemy to be conquered, not a partner to be won. She knew what her father would have done. She knew what to do. But to act was to be seen. To be seen was a risk. She looked from the terrified horse to the hard, unyielding man on the fence. For 2 weeks, she had been invisible, a ghost in a calico dress. But the sight of that beautiful creature being brutalized broke through her fear. She dropped the wet sheet in her basket, wiped her damp hands on her apron, and walked toward the corral. The ranch hands fell silent as she approached. Cole turned to her, his expression hostile. "This ain't no place for you, girl. Get back to your laundry." Ilara ignored him. Her eyes were on Blackwood. She stopped at the foot of the fence, her gaze lifted to his. "You're scaring him," she said, her voice quiet but clear. Blackwood looked down at her. His expression did not change, and but a flicker of something, annoyance, surprise, moved in his gray eyes. "He's a wild horse. He's supposed to be scared." "He's supposed to be listening," she corrected gently. "But you're all shouting. Let me try." A snort of derisive laughter came from one of the hands. "She'll get herself trampled." Cole stepped forward. "Boss, this is foolishness." Blackwood didn't look at his foreman. His gaze remained locked on Ilara. He studied her face, the quiet certainty in her eyes. He saw no arrogance, only a strange, compelling confidence. He had bought her for $2 to end a pathetic scene. He had hidden her away in his laundry to forget about it. Now, this ghost was standing before him, questioning the methods of his best men. He should have sent her away. He should have told her to mind her place. But he didn't. He gave a curt nod. "Open the gate." Cole stared at him in disbelief. "Boss?" "You heard me. Let her in. Everyone else out." The men backed away from the corral, their faces a mixture of shock and morbid anticipation. Cole, his face thunderous, unlatched the gate and swung it open just enough for her to slip through. "It's your funeral," he muttered. Ilara stepped into the corral. The world shrank to the circle of dusty ground, the terrified horse, and the silent man watching from the fence. The stallion stood in the center, its sides heaving, its nostrils flared. It watched her, every muscle tense to either fight or flee. She did not walk toward it. She turned her back on it, a gesture of trust that went against every instinct of survival. She walked to the water trough in the corner and dipped her hands in, rinsing off the lingering scent of lye soap. She moved slowly, deliberately, with no sudden gestures. She began to hum, a low, tuneless melody her father used to use, a sound that was more a vibration in the air than a song. The horse snorted, stamping a hoof, but it did not charge. It watched her. She kept humming, her movements slow and rhythmic as she walked the perimeter of the corral, never looking directly at the horse, but always aware of it. She was not a threat. She was just a quiet, predictable presence in its space. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The sun beat down. The only sounds were her low humming and the horse's breathing, which was slowly, almost imperceptibly, evening out. Finally, she stopped and slowly turned to face it. She did not make eye contact. She looked at its shoulder, its powerful chest, and she held out a hand, palm down, and took a single, slow step forward. The horse tensed. Its ears swiveled, its skin twitched, but it held its ground. "You're a fine, strong fellow," she murmured, her voice as soft as the dust motes dancing in the sunlight. "No one means you harm. They just don't know your language." Another step. She was close now, close enough to smell the horse's fear, the wild scent of sage and prairie clinging to its coat. She kept her hand out, waiting. The stallion lowered its head, its nostrils flaring as it scented her. It was a moment of supreme tension. A single wrong move, a flicker of fear from her, and it would all be over. But Alara felt no fear. Here, in this dusty circle with this wild creature, she was not the $2 woman. She was her father's daughter. She was home. The horse stretched its neck forward and touched its velvety nose to her outstretched hand. It was a contact so light it was barely there, a question asked in a language older than words. She let her breath out in a slow, silent sigh. She did not move to stroke it. She just let it investigate her, learn her scent, feel the calm that radiated from her. From his perch on the fence, Silas Blackwood watched, unmoving. He had seen the best horse breakers in the territory fail with animals less wild than this one. He had watched them use ropes and spurs and raw strength to bend a horse's will. He had never seen this quiet negotiation, this silent conversation. He was not just watching a woman gentle a horse. He was watching something he had thought long dead, a flicker of grace in a brutal world. The woman he had bought for $2 out of a strange, irritated pity was doing something his entire ranch, with all its power and wealth, could not. After a long moment, the stallion nudged her hand again, a little firmer this time. A request. Slowly, ever so slowly, Alara raised her other hand and brought it up to the horse's face, letting her fingers trail along the strong line of its jaw. The horse did not pull back. It leaned into her touch, its eyes softening. She had done it. She had not broken the horse. She had earned it. She spent another 10 minutes with the horse just touching it, speaking to it in low tones, until it stood quietly, its head lowered, a picture of calm acceptance. Finally, she turned and walked back to the gate, her movements as unhurried as before. She did not look back at the horse. She did not have to. The bond was made. She slipped out of the corral, and Cole shut the gate behind her with a thud. The ranch hands stared at her with a new expression, awe. She had walked into the lion's den and walked out with its trust. Alara's gaze went straight to Silas Blackwood. He was still on the fence, but he had straightened up, his arms no longer crossed. He was looking at her, really looking at her, and for the first time, she felt like he saw a person. He swung himself down from the fence, landing softly in the dust. He walked over to her, stopping a few feet away. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken things. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice low. "Ilara." "You have a gift, Ilara," he said. It was not a compliment. It was a statement of fact, spoken with a kind of grudging wonder. "My father taught me," she said simply. He nodded slowly. His eyes went from her to the now calm stallion and back again. "You're done with the laundry. he said. It was an order. From now on, you work with the horses. Cole will show you what needs doing. He turned and walked away before she could respond, his back once again a formidable wall. But this time, it felt different. It felt like the wall had a crack in it, a tiny fissure through which an impossible light had just begun to shine. She had arrived as a debt. She had been treated as an object. But in that dusty corral, she had just proven she was worth more than $2. She was worth something real. And the powerful, broken man who owned her indenture had finally started to see it. The shift in her duties changed everything. Moving from the steamy confinement of the laundry to the open air of the stables and corrals was like being allowed to breathe again. The other ranch hands who had once ignored her or watched her with suspicion now treated her with a grudging respect. They had seen what she could do. They called her the Horse Whisperer behind her back, a name spoken with wonder instead of contempt. Cole, the foreman, was the hardest to win over. He was a man who believed in sweat and muscle, and her quiet methods were foreign to him. But he was also a practical man. He assigned her the most difficult animals, the flighty mare who shied at shadows, the stubborn gelding who refused to be saddled, the young colts who had known nothing but wildness. And one by one, with patience and that uncanny calm, she won them over. If the work of the ranch went smoother, fewer animals were injured, fewer men were thrown. Her value became measurable in the quiet efficiency she brought to the stables. Silas Blackwood kept his distance, but she felt his eyes on her. She would be working with a horse in the round pen and feel a stillness in the air, and she would know he was there, watching from the porch of the main house or from the shadow of the barn. He never approached. He never spoke of it, but he watched. One evening, she was in the barn late, tending to a foal that had been born sickly. It was weak, refusing to nurse properly. Maria had declared it a lost cause, but Alara couldn't give up on it. She sat on the clean straw of the birthing stall, patiently coaxing the foal, trying to get it to take a bottle of warmed goat's milk. The rest of the ranch was quiet, and the men in the bunkhouse or in town. The main barn door creaked open, and a tall silhouette filled the frame. It was Blackwood. He walked in, his spurs making no sound on the dirt floor. He had learned to walk silently, a habit from a past she couldn't guess at. Maria said the foal was failing, he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet barn. It has a fighting spirit, Alara answered, not looking up. It just needs a little help finding its strength. She felt him come to stand at the edge of the stall, looking down at her and the tiny, shivering creature in her lap. You spend a lot of time with lost causes, he observed. His voice was flat, but she heard something underneath it, a note of bitter self-recognition. There's no such thing, she said softly. Just things some people give up on too soon. The words hung in the air between them. It was the most they had ever said to each other. He was quiet for so long she thought he had left, but when she finally glanced up, he was still there, his face half in shadow, his expression unreadable. It's cold in here, he said, his voice suddenly rough. He turned and left without another word. A few minutes later, he returned. He was carrying a thick wool blanket. He didn't hand it to her. He unfolded it and draped it carefully over her shoulders. His fingers brushed the back of her neck, a brief, accidental touch that sent a jolt through her, warm and sharp as lightning. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. He pulled his hand back as if he'd been burned. For a tense moment, neither of them moved, and the air was thick with the things they weren't saying. The scent of him, leather, dust, and a clean, cold scent like the winter air surrounded her. Thank you, she whispered to the straw. He just grunted in response and retreated to the shadows at the edge of the stall, leaning against a post to watch. He stayed for over an hour, a silent, brooding sentinel in the darkness, while she worked with the foal. They didn't speak again, but his presence was a strange comfort. When the foal finally, weakly, began to suckle from the bottle, a small sigh of relief escaped her. She looked up to share the victory, but he was gone. The only evidence he had been there at all was the heavy, warm blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. Another time, he found her in the tack room, struggling to reach a heavy harness hung on a high peg. And she was standing on a rickety crate stretching, her fingers just brushing the leather. He came in behind her, his shadow falling over her. "Here," he said, his voice close to her ear. He reached over her, his arm brushing her side, and easily lifted the harness down. His body was a wall of warmth behind her. For a second she was pinned between him and the wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could feel the heat of him, hear the soft sound of his breathing. He stepped back immediately, putting distance between them. He held out the harness. "You should be careful," he said, his voice gruff. "That crate is rotten." She took the harness, her fingers trembling slightly. "I can manage?" "I know you can," he said, and the words held a surprising weight. He looked around the tack room, his eyes noting the things she had organized, the leather she had mended and oiled. His gaze was thoughtful. He left without another word. The next morning, when she entered the tack room, there was a small, sturdy step stool made of freshly cut pine sitting just inside the door. It was simple, unadorned, and perfectly crafted. There was no note. No one said a word. But she knew. He had seen her struggle, and he had built her a solution. The quiet, anonymous act of care touched her more deeply than any words could have. She ran her hand over the smooth wood, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the morning sun. Slowly, tentatively, the ice around Silas Blackwood was beginning to thaw. He started speaking to her, not just about the horses, but other things. He would ask her opinion on a new pasture, or the quality of the hay. He started calling her by her name more often. One day, they worked side by side for an hour, repairing a section of fence the wild stallion had damaged in its first days. They moved in a comfortable, efficient silence, handing tools back and forth without needing to ask. The silence was not empty. It was full of a shared understanding. But with this growing closeness came a new danger: gossip. The ranch hands saw the change in the boss. Maria, the housekeeper, watched them with sharp, worried eyes. And when Silas began to insist Alara take her meals in the main house kitchen instead of alone in the barn, the whispers grew louder. The true threat, however, did not come from within the ranch. It rode in from town one sun-drenched afternoon in the form of Jedediah Croft, the banker who had auctioned her off. He arrived in a buggy, his face flushed with self-importance. With him was the town's part-time sheriff, a man whose loyalty was known to belong to whoever paid him last. Silas met them on the porch, his body language a study in contained hostility. Ilara was in the near corral, working with a young filly, but she saw them arrive. A cold dread washed over her. Croft had not forgotten his humiliation. "Blackwood," Croft said, stepping down from his buggy with a smug smile. "A beautiful day." "State your business, Croft," Silas said, his voice flat. Croft's smile widened. "My business is property recovery. I'm here for the woman, Alara Stone." He pointed a chubby finger toward the corral. Silas didn't even glance her way. He stepped forward, blocking Croft's view. "Her debt was paid. I have the receipt." "Ah, but there's the matter," Croft said, savoring the moment. "You paid $2, a pittance, an insult. I have since had a lawyer from the Capitol review the case. The sale was illegitimate. An auction of indenture requires a bid that reasonably addresses the debt. $2 does not. The sale is void." He produced a sheaf of papers with an official-looking seal. "She is still legally bound to serve out her husband's debt. And since I am the holder of that debt, she is bound to me. The sheriff shifted his feet, looking uncomfortable but resolute. It's the law, Silas. The paper seems to be in order. This is my land, Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. Your paper means nothing here. Is that so? Croft's eyes gleamed with malice. You're a powerful man, Blackwood, but you're not above the law. When if you harbor a debtor, if you refuse a legal warrant, you'll be the one facing a judge. Your reputation, your good name, all of it tarnished. Over what? A piece of stray livestock you picked up for $2. The words hit Alara like a physical blow. She stood frozen in the corral, the filly's lead rope slack in her hand. This was her fault. Her past, her shame, had followed her here, to this one place she had begun to feel safe. It was going to destroy the man who had, for his own reasons, sheltered her. She saw the impossible choice in the rigid line of his back. He could fight for her and risk his entire standing, his entire world, or he could hand her over, the rational, sensible choice. She was, after all, just a 2-year contract. He could simply buy another. She watched him, her heart in her throat, fearing he would make the logical choice, fearing he would let her go. And a part of her, the part that had started to care for this broken, silent man, knew she could not let him pay that price for her. The silence on the porch stretched, taut as a wire. Silas stood like a statue, his face unreadable, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He was weighing his ranch, his name, his entire world against the woman in the corral. Alara could see the war raging within him. She saw the sheriff's hand drift toward the pistol on his hip. She saw the triumphant, ugly smile on Croft's face. She couldn't let this happen. She could not be the fuse that ignited his ruin. With a resolve that came from a place of deep, aching gratitude, she dropped the lead rope. The filly, sensing her distress, shied away. Ilara walked toward the porch, her steps steady, her head held high for the first time since she'd arrived in this territory. The dust puffed up around her worn boots. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, not looking at Silas, but at Croft. "There is no need for trouble, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice clear and firm, betraying none of the terror that was screaming inside her. "I will honor my husband's debt. I will go with you." The words landed like stones in the quiet yard. Cole, who had been watching from the barn, swore under his breath. Maria, on the porch, let out a small, choked gasp. Silas turned his head slowly, his gray eyes finally meeting hers. The look in them was devastating. It was a maelstrom of fury, frustration, and a raw, unguarded pain that stole her breath. It was the look of a man watching something precious being ripped from his grasp. In that one look, she saw everything he had never said. "Ilara." "No," he said, his voice a ragged whisper. "You have shown me kindness, Mr. Blackwood," she said, forcing herself to keep her voice even. "More than I deserved. I will not be the cause of your ruin. It is my debt. I will pay it." She was rescuing him in the only way she knew how. She was taking the trouble away, just as he had tried to do for her at the auction. Croft's laughter was a vile, crowing sound. "Well, it seems the woman has more sense than you do, Blackwood. She knows her place." He gestured to the buggy. "Get in, girl. We have a long ride." She turned, giving Silas one last fleeting look. "Thank you," she mouthed silently. Then she walked to the buggy and climbed in without assistance, her back straight, her face a pale, emotionless mask. She did not look back. If she looked back, she would break. The sheriff tipped his hat awkwardly at Silas. "Sorry for this, Silas. It's the law." Silas did not answer. He stood frozen on the porch as Croft climbed into the buggy, snapped the reins, and drove away, kicking up a cloud of dust that obscured the sight of the departing woman. He watched until the buggy was a small speck in the distance, until the dust had settled back onto the empty road. The ranch was silent. The men watched their boss, waiting for an explosion, an order, something. But Silas Blackwood did nothing. He turned, his face like thunder, and strode into his house. The door slammed shut behind him with the force of a gunshot. Inside, he went to his study, a room that smelled of old leather and whiskey. He stood by the window, staring out at the empty yard, at the corral where she had stood. The house felt hollow, the silence pressing in on him. For years, since his wife's death, the silence had been his companion, his shield. Now, it was an accusation. He had let her go. He had stood there and let that greasy swine Croft take her. For what? To protect his name? To avoid a legal fight? He had built this ranch from nothing, fought off rustlers, and stared down nature itself. He had faced down armed men without flinching. But he had let a smirking banker with a piece of paper walk away with the one thing that had brought a spark of life back into his desolate world. The wall he had built around his heart, and the wall that Alara had so patiently and unknowingly chipped away at crumbled. The grief for his wife, the guilt over his stillborn son, the years of self-imposed loneliness, it all came rushing in, and at the center of the storm was a new, sharper pain. The loss of her. He had bought her for $2, a transaction of cold convenience, but she had become priceless. Her quiet strength, her gentle hands with the horses, the way she looked at him as if he were a man worth saving, not a monster to be feared. She had seen the man buried beneath the grief and the bitterness. She had healed his horses, and in doing so, had begun to heal him. And he had let her go. The crisis was a cold, hard knot in his chest. He was alone again. The ranch was just land and buildings. The money was just paper. Without her, it was all worthless. The silence of the house was no longer a comfort. It was a tomb. He had retreated back into his damage, and it was colder and darker than ever before. He sank into the chair behind his desk, the powerful rancher, the king of his own territory, utterly and completely defeated. Night fell. Silas sat in the dark of his study, the whiskey bottle on his desk untouched. The despair had passed, leaving in its wake a cold, clear rage. It was a rage directed not at Croft, not at the law, but at himself. He had failed her. He had let procedure and reputation matter more than a person. He would not make that mistake again. He lit a lamp, the flame chasing the shadows from the room. He pulled the $2 receipt from his coat pocket and stared at it. A legal proceeding, Croft had said. He had built his empire on understanding rules and contracts better than his opponents. He had let Croft's fancy paper intimidate him. He wouldn't let it happen again. He rose and went to the door. Cole was standing on the porch, a silent, worried shape in the moonlight. "Saddle my horse," Silas said, his voice hard as iron, "and the fastest one you've got for yourself. We're riding to the county seat." Cole nodded, no questions asked. He had seen the look on his boss's face. It was the same look he'd worn the time they hunted the rustlers who'd stolen half their herd. It was a look that promised a reckoning. Meanwhile, Ilara sat in a small, locked room above the saloon in Redemption. Croft had not taken her to his home. He had installed her here, like a piece of luggage, telling her he would arrange for her placement in the morning. The room was dirty, the air thick with the smell of stale beer and desperation from the floor below. She was not a weeper. She had not cried when Thomas died, nor when she had starved, nor when she stood on that auction block. But now, alone in the dark, the tears came. Not for her own fate, but for the memory of that wool blanket on her shoulders, the sturdy step stool, the look in Silas Blackwood's eyes as she was taken away. She had found a moment of grace, a glimpse of a home, and it had been torn away. But beneath the grief, a harder resolve was forming. She was not her husband's debt. She was not Croft's property. She was Ilara. She had calmed a wild stallion. She had survived. She would not be a passive victim waiting for her fate. She got up and went to the door. It was solid, the lock firm. The window looked down onto a narrow, dark alley. It was a 12-foot drop at least. She sat on the edge of the lumpy bed, forcing herself to think. Croft was arrogant. He thought she was a broken, compliant woman. He would be careless. She listened to the sounds from the saloon below, shouting, a piano, a crash of glass. No one would hear her. She looked around the grimy room. A flimsy chair, a pitcher and basin, the bed. Nothing. Then she remembered the way Croft had sneered. She knows her place. He saw her as chattel, unintelligent and without resource. That was his weakness. She thought about knots, about ropes, about leverage. Her father had taught her not just about horses, but about the tools of a farm. She looked at the thin blanket and the lumpy mattress. She went to the bed and tore at the stitching of the mattress ticking. It was filled with straw, but the ticking itself was coarse, strong canvas. With patient, determined fingers, she began to tear it into long strips. Hours later, Silas and Cole thundered into the county seat, their horses lathered. Silas went straight to the home of Judge Miller, an old, stern man he had known for years, a man whose integrity was beyond question. He pounded on the door until a light appeared. He laid the story out, his voice clipped and precise. He told of the auction, the $2 bid, and Croft's reappearance with a new warrant. The judge listened, his face grim. "Jedediah Croft is a leech, but he's a careful one," the judge said, examining Croft's warrant, which Silas had snatched from the town sheriff's hand before he'd left. "This document looks legal. But the premise, voiding a public auction after the fact, it stinks." "The original debt," Silas pressed. "It was for her husband, Thomas Stone. Check the records. I have a feeling Croft's ledger doesn't tell the whole story." They spent the next 2 hours in the county clerk's office, going through dusty record books by lamplight, and there they found it. Thomas Stone's original debt to Croft's bank was for $20, for seed and supplies, a debt he had been paying off. The $100 figure was a complete fabrication, a number Croft had invented after the man's death, adding fraudulent fees and interest to trap the widow. The entire indenture was based on a lie. "Fraud," the judge declared, his voice ringing with fury. "Outright, predatory fraud." He signed a new warrant, not for Ilara's return, but for Jedediah Croft's arrest. As the sun began to rise, Silas rode back toward redemption, not with the rage of a defeated man, but with the cold, righteous fury of an avenger. He had the truth in his pocket. He was coming for her. But Ilara was not waiting. In the pre-dawn gloom, she finished her work. She had braided the canvas strips into a surprisingly strong rope. She tied one end to the heavy iron leg of the bedstead, testing it with her full weight. It held. She threw the other end out the window. It reached the ground. Taking a deep breath, she swung herself out into the cold morning air. The rope bit into her hands, but she held on, her father's lessons on grip and balance coming back to her. She scrambled down, her boots finding purchase on the rough wooden wall of the saloon. She landed softly in the alley, not her heart pounding. She was free. She didn't run. Running was for the guilty. She walked, head high, out of the alley and into the main street of Redemption, just as the town was beginning to stir. She went straight to the livery stable. The stable boy's jaw dropped when he saw her. "I need a horse," she said. I can't, Mrs. Stone. Mr. Croft gave orders." "Do you fear him more than you fear Mr. Blackwood?" she asked, her voice steady. The boy's eyes widened. He knew who owned this town, and it wasn't the banker. He saddled a horse without another word. Just as she was about to ride out, 2 horses galloped into town from the west. It was Silas and Cole. Silas pulled his horse to a halt, his eyes finding her immediately. Relief, raw and profound, washed over his face, followed by astonishment. Elara. Her name was a breath. How? I left, she said simply. He swung down from his horse, crossing the distance between them in 3 long strides. He stopped in front of her, his hands coming up as if to touch her face, then stopping, hovering in the air. I was coming for you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I know, she said. And she did. At that moment, Jedediah Croft came out of the saloon, his face puffy from sleep. He saw them, and his expression turned to thunder. What is the meaning of this? That woman is my property. Sheriff, arrest her. Silas turned slowly, a predator's grace in his movement. He held up the warrant from Judge Miller. The only person getting arrested today is you, Croft, for fraud, extortion, and illegal indenture. Croft's face went white. The town sheriff, seeing the judge's signature, had immediately switched his allegiance, his hand moving to Croft's arm. The townsfolk, drawn by the commotion, gathered to watch, their whispers turning from speculation about Elara to condemnation of the banker. Silas turned back to Elara, his eyes holding hers. He had ridden through the night for her. He had stood against the law for her. He had brought the truth to light. But she had saved herself. The rescue was mutual. In front of the entire town, in the morning light, Silas Blackwood reached out and took her hand. It was not the gesture of a man claiming property. It was the gesture of a man who had found his equal. The $2 paid a fraudulent debt, he said, his voice loud enough for all to hear. It bought you your freedom, but your place, that is for you to choose. He paused, his gaze searching hers. There is a place for you at Blackwood Creek, not as a servant, as its heart, if you will have it. She looked at his hand holding hers, at the strength and the warmth in it. She looked at his face, at the walls that had finally come down, revealing the honorable, caring man beneath. She looked at the town that had scorned her, now watching in humbled silence. She was no longer the $2 woman. She was Elara, and she was home. I will, she said, her voice clear and strong. Her hand tightened in his. A new chapter had begun, not of indenture, but of partnership. One that was worth more than his whole ranch, and they both knew it. Life at Blackwood Creek settled into a new kind of peace. Croft was gone, his assets seized and his reputation shattered, a cautionary tale whispered in the saloons across the territory. Elara was no longer an employee, bound by a shameful contract. She was the mistress of the ranch, a title unspoken but understood by all. Maria, the stern housekeeper, now met her with a smile, deferring to her on matters of the household. Cole and the ranch hands treated her with a deep, abiding respect, not just for her skill with horses, but for the quiet strength they had all witnessed. The small tack room in the barn was cleared out, but Elara asked that the cot be left. It was a reminder of where she had started, a touchstone of humility. Her things were moved into a large, airy room in the main house, a room with a window that looked out over the rolling hills and the creek that gave the ranch its name. It was the room that had belonged to Silas's wife. He had not been inside it for years, but he was the one who opened the door for Elara, a silent, profound gesture of letting go of his past grief to make room for a future. She did not try to erase the memory of the woman who came before her. She respected it, but she brought her own life into the space. She placed a jar of wildflowers on the dresser. She set up a small table for her mending. Slowly, the room and the house itself began to lose its air of a shrine to sorrow and started to feel like a home again. It began to breathe. Silas changed. The harsh lines around his eyes softened. The permanent tension in his shoulders eased. He still worked as hard as ever, but the frantic, punishing edge was gone. He began to join her for meals on the porch in the evening, not just in the formal dining room. They would sit in the comfortable silence they had perfected, watching the sun set, the sky a blaze of color over their kingdom. He showed her the ledgers of the ranch, explaining the business, the challenges, the triumphs. He valued her opinion, her sharp, practical mind. She, in turn, continued her work with the horses, her presence a calming influence that spread through the entire herd. The wild chestnut stallion, whom she had named Valor, was now her personal mount. He followed her like a shadow, a testament to the bond of trust she had forged. One afternoon, he found her in a small, neglected patch of ground behind the house, pulling weeds. "What are you doing?" he asked, a rare smile touching his lips. "The soil is good here," she said, wiping a smudge of dirt from her nose. "I thought I might plant an herb garden. For the kitchen. And for remedies." The next morning, she woke to find the patch of ground had been perfectly tilled and fenced with new timber. A small gate hung at the entrance. Silas was nowhere to be seen, already out on the range, but the evidence of his care was there, solid and real as the earth itself. Their love story was not one of grand declarations or passionate speeches. It was built in these quiet moments. A cup of coffee he left for her by the corral fence at dawn. A shirt of his she mended, reinforcing a seam she knew would be strained by his work. The way he would stop and watch her with Valor. A look of quiet wonder on his face. The way she would save him a plate of supper, keeping it warm on the stove for when he came in late, long after the rest of the ranch was asleep. He never spoke of his first wife, or the child they lost. But one day, he took her to a quiet spot on a hill overlooking the creek, where a single, weathered wooden cross stood beneath a cottonwood tree. They stood there for a long time, and he reached for her hand, his grip tight. He didn't say a word, but she understood. He was sharing his deepest wound with her, letting her into the most guarded part of his heart. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a silent promise that he did not have to carry his grief alone anymore. The seasons turned. The green of spring deepened into the gold of summer, then faded to the brown of autumn. The $2 auction in Redemption felt like a lifetime ago, a story that had happened to someone else. Alara had found more than a home. She had found herself. She was no longer defined by her loss or her shame. She was defined by her strength, her compassion, and the love of a good man who had seen her true worth when no one else had. One crisp autumn evening, they sat on the porch, a shared blanket across their laps. The air was cool, carrying the scent of wood smoke and pine. The ranch was quiet, the day's work done. Valor grazed peacefully in the paddock below. Silas turned to her, his gray eyes warm in the lantern light. He had been quiet for a long time. "I was a dead man walking, Alara," he said, his voice low and raw. "This ranch, this land, it was just a place to bury myself. You came here and you made it live again. You made me live again." She put her hand over his on the blanket. "You rescued me, Silas. You gave me a chance when I had nothing." "No," he said, shaking his head. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, a gesture of reverence that made her heart ache. "I bought a piece of paper for $2. You saved my soul. You are worth more than every acre, every head of cattle, everything I own. You are everything." He didn't need to say the words. In the quiet of the vast frontier, under a blanket of stars, their shared gaze said it all. The man who had been closed off and broken was whole. The woman who had been alone and discarded was cherished. They had rescued each other, forging a love as strong and enduring as the land itself. The frontier was still wild, but here, on this porch, in this shared silence, they had built a sanctuary. They were home.